Welcome to Boston Children's Answers Parentcast. I'm your host, Jennifer Arnold. As a doctor and a mom, I'm passionate about helping kids stay happy and healthy. So join me as I chat with other Boston children's experts to find answers for you and your family. Hey everyone, and welcome back. Thanks for joining us today because we're talking about a very important topic and one that I think many of us have a lot of questions about, and that's dyslexia. As always, let's start off with our parent question.
Hi, I'm Anne. My son was just diagnosed with dyslexia. Will he be able to learn to read? I don't want this to hold him back. How can I best help him?
Thank you so much, Anne. I hope to be able to answer your question and more with the help of Dr. Margaret Pierce. Dr. Pierce is an oral and written language specialist here at Boston Children's Hospital. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Pierce.
Hello, and thank you for having me.
I'm so excited to be able to talk with you today and learn more about, dyslexia and other language-based learning challenges. But maybe before we start off, I should ask you a little bit about what is an oral and written language specialist?
Absolutely. An oral and written language specialist is somebody who has deep expertise in language and literacy development. So many of us work in the schools, working with kids who struggle with learning to speak and listen and read and write. And then some, like myself, work in more clinical settings, like in the Learning Disabilities program here at Boston Children's Hospital.
How did you end up in the field? I'm curious.
My journey to this role began 30 years ago when I was starting my career as an elementary school teacher. So I was teaching second grade, my first year of teaching, and I had several students in my class who were really struggling to learn to read. And no matter what I did, I didn't seem to be able to help them. Those students were later diagnosed with dyslexia, and they ultimately learned to read. However, I did not play a big role in their success. And after 2 years of teaching, I decided that I really needed to go back to school to find out more about why some kids struggle to learn to read. So I got my master's degree and returned to the classroom and began putting into effect a lot of what I had learned, and it worked. But one of the things that I discovered was that for all the students I had in my class, they each had individual journeys to literacy. Every kid took a different path. And some of those kids, it seemed to happen almost naturally with little effort on my part. And with other kids, it seemed to take a lot of work. And I wanted to understand more about why that was. And so I returned to school again, this time to get my doctorate in language and literacy development. And as part of my training, I did an internship in the Learning Disabilities program here at Boston Children's. Wow. And I worked with my mentor at the time, Dr. Grant Chaffee, who taught me how to administer assessments and how to look at the numbers in kids' scores, but also how to look deeper and to see what kids were doing, how they were approaching speaking, listening, reading, and writing tasks. And that has inspired a career where I have just enjoyed the process of seeing who these amazing kids are and understanding their individuality and helping to turn around their educational experience.
That's so incredible. And you're clearly a woman after my own heart since you are a lifelong learner like me.
Absolutely.
I love that. And you're making a difference in the learning of so many kids. So that's incredible. As we get started into the topic a little bit, if you could just really define for folks that may not be clear on what is dyslexia.
Sure. Dyslexia is a specific learning disability that is a neurological difference in how the brain processes language, both oral and written. The defining characteristic of dyslexia is that kids struggle to read words accurately. They can also struggle to spell words accurately. When you can't read or spell words, it becomes really difficult to read books, to read paragraphs and stories. And so a child with dyslexia will struggle when they're reading, often reading well below grade level, because they can't figure out what the words on the page say. They can also sometimes struggle to understand what they're reading. But when a child with dyslexia is having difficulty understanding, it's often because they've been putting too much energy into reading the words on the page that they haven't been able to pay attention to what the story was saying.
Yeah, so by the time they get there, they've kind of lost what they read in the beginning.
Exactly.
Wow.
But if you read it to them, then they'd be able to understand what they were reading.
Oh, wow.
So that's an important distinction. Some children who struggle to learn to read struggle because they have not been given good instruction. And that's not dyslexia.
Yeah.
Some kids may have another kind of disability, like a visual impairment or a cognitive disability, and that's also not dyslexia. So these are important parts of the diagnostic process.
To share a little bit about my own experience, both of my children have some language learning needs and challenges, and so it's both receptive and expressive, they say, is two big categories. What we've been going through is trying to really tease out, what are the challenges from a learning perspective that they have, so that we can identify the best way to support them.
Absolutely. And one of the questions I get asked by parents, one of the most common questions is, does my child have dyslexia? That's an easy one for me to answer, right? I can administer assessments and answer that question pretty readily. But then the follow-up question, and the one that's harder to answer, is what does my child need in order to thrive?
Yes.
And in order to answer that question well, we really need to understand much more about who the child is. What are their strengths and challenges? And what are the learning environments where they're going to thrive and be able to remove some of the barriers that have been holding them back from developing literacy.
Now, even within that scope of dyslexia, are there different subtypes of dyslexia that parents should be aware of?
If you look on the internet for that answer, you will see 100 different answers to that question. The research does offer converging evidence for at least two subtypes of dyslexia. The most common cause of the kind of word reading difficulties that kids with dyslexia exhibit is difficulties with phonological processing. So this is awareness of the sounds that make up words. So in order to learn to read, you have to appreciate the fact that words are made up of sounds. And in our language, those sounds get represented by letters. So you have to know that B says B, and A says A, and T says T. And when you know all of those, you can put it together and read a word bat.
Yeah, phonics.
Right, exactly. It's the underpinning of our phonics system. A lot of kids with dyslexia have difficulties with that. They hear the word bat, but they don't hear it as being made up of three different sounds. And so therefore, it's harder for them to master the phonics system that their teachers are trying to teach them. That's the most common difficulty among kids with dyslexia. But there's another group of kids who also have difficulty rapidly retrieving associations between letters and sounds. So they might get that a word can be broken down into sounds. But when they're looking at the B, and they have to remember from their brain that B says B, it's inefficient pulling that information out of their head. We call that rapid naming.
Okay.
Your ability to rapidly retrieve verbal labels for the symbols in our language system.
Oh, wow.
And of course, some kids have both challenges with phonological processing and rapid naming. Marianne Wolf, who was a professor at Tufts for many years here in the Boston area, she called that the double deficit subtype of dyslexia. Wow. And in fact, those kids are the ones who are the most impaired at reading.
Oh my goodness. So that could be a lot, right? The one subtype related to the phonics, is really the ability to associate, right, the sound with the words or the letters that you see, and then the other one is how quickly you can make that association. Is that correct?
That's right. There's one that's much more about automaticity or speed, right?
Yeah.
The fluency with which you can pull these learned associations from your brain, and the other one, it really has more to do with your ability to divide the speech stream into sounds, which you have to do in order to learn how to read.
Yeah. Our brain is so complicated.
It is, and yet it's miraculous. So.
It is. Dr. Pierce, you mentioned that, dyslexia is a learning disability, and I'm just thinking for our audience it would be really helpful to understand, what are learning disabilities and how does dyslexia fit into the spectrum?
Well, learning disabilities are persistent difficulties developing academic skills. We talk about learning disabilities as affecting reading, writing, and mathematics, which are those basic building block skills that are necessary for academic learning to happen. And these learning challenges, they persist despite adequate instruction, despite the child having average to above average intellectual ability. They're surprising.
So what I'm hearing from you is it's, it's not the same as having intellectual disability, and even within the learning disability spectrum, there's different types that a child might have.
Of course, there are all kinds of disabilities that will affect a child's academic progress, intellectual disability being one of them, and we have specialized approaches that are necessary for teaching kids with intellectual disability functional skills. Learning disabilities is a different ball game, right? These kids have different needs as well, and so it's important to make the distinction on the type of disability that a child has in order to make sure that you are providing the right kind of educational program for them.
That's great. So I'm curious then, what is the experience like for kids that may have dyslexia, and what things based on ages and stages maybe parents should be aware of?
Dyslexia is right now most commonly diagnosed in early elementary school, but children do show red flags of dyslexia even earlier on, as early as preschool. And so we can look for those red flags and understand what the experiences are of a child as young as 3 to 4 years old. So a child who's in preschool who might be at risk for developing dyslexia will certainly be having difficulty learning those letters of the alphabet. That's a big task of preschool and something that will be difficult for them. They might also mispronounce names that they should have figured out at that time. And then finally, another early preschool kind of kindergarten skill is developing some of those early phonological awareness skills like rhyming. So many books that preschoolers and kindergartners reading, like Dr. Seuss, have rhymes. And these kids have a really hard time appreciating those rhymes and being able to generate rhyming words themselves.
Wow.
So that's what it might look like in preschool. And then reading instruction starts to happen in earnest in kindergarten. And so kids are expected to master those letter names. They're expected to learn the sounds that get associated with those letters. And they're supposed to begin to identify some high-frequency sight words like the and a and of, a lot of which actually break the rules of our phonics system.
Yes.
And kids with dyslexia are pretty slow in the development of those skills. So they may end kindergarten and not have mastered all of their letter names yet. They might not know all of their letter sounds. They might know only a few sight words. Again, these are red flags that these kids need something a little bit more specialized and supportive in order to keep pace and develop those early literacy skills. First and second grade is when kids are expected to be really mastering the phonics code.
Okay.
And so kids at this stage that are dyslexic are probably making slower progress in mastering the ability to sound out unfamiliar words. They'll often, as a result, over-rely on visual recognition, taking a mental picture of what a word looks like.
Oh,
It seems like that would be a good strategy, except that a lot of our words look very similar. Yeah. Girl and grill look very similar, right?
Yes.
Or, here and her look very similar. And so, these kids, if they're relying on a picture that they've taken, that they've memorized of a word, they might make reading errors and read a word as something that looks the same but isn't the same.
Wow.
So as kids get a little bit older, they're expected to start reading longer words. They're supposed to be able to take multi-syllable words and break them into chunks and decode those parts. They're also supposed to be able to read more fluently. And a child with dyslexia will have difficulty. They'll often read the beginning part of the word and then guess a word that would make sense in the passage or that has the same beginning sounds. And their reading will have errors in it and will be slow and effortful, or will be very fast and very imprecise as a compensatory strategy. So as you get into fourth grade, this is a time period that teachers will recognize as a transition from learning to read to using reading to learn, to learn. And so a child who is dyslexic, who has not been sufficiently remediated, will probably at this point start to avoid reading. They may only be willing to read graphic novels because the pictures help them figure out what the words will say. When they avoid reading, the problem is that they will fall behind in the skills that children develop through reading. So vocabulary knowledge, knowledge of advanced grammar patterns, and also background knowledge. When we read, we learn about the world and we build all sorts of knowledge about ancient civilizations and countries around the world. And these kids are avoiding reading, and so they're not building that knowledge. And so as a result, you start to get kids who begin having real comprehension issues. Even if they are able to listen to the text, they may lack the background knowledge and vocabulary knowledge to fully understand what they're reading.
Wow. And even hearing, to your point.
Exactly.
So the gap between them and their peers could really grow, that divide.
Absolutely. And, where their difficulties might have been localized to reading and writing in the early grades, suddenly they may begin struggling in science and social studies, which may have been their areas of haven before, but now suddenly is prohibitively difficult because they can't read in order to learn the material.
I just want to say that was so enlightening, and I think for any parent, whether or not you might have a child with dyslexia, just sort of knowing what that normal progression needs to be would be so helpful, because I think, I don't know, I think as parents that maybe aren't as attuned as you are, at least I'm speaking for myself, knowing these milestones is really key so that you can be on the lookout to advocate for your child.
Absolutely.
Whether or not there may be something going on that needs to be evaluated. So I think that's really helpful. I hope all of our parents are listening and taking notes there.
Yes. And of course, knowing that your school is a resource and that your child's teacher is taking a close look at this as well. One of the interesting innovations in Massachusetts is that we are instituting early screening for dyslexia. So
that's wonderful.
As early as kindergarten, kids are being screened twice a year in order to try to identify children who have dyslexia as early as possible, because of course we know that early intervention is key to helping these children not fall behind.
Wow.
So that should be happening in the Massachusetts public schools in grades kindergarten through grade 2.
Is that common other places? If you don't have to answer if you don't know, but I'm just curious, having moved from another place where I don't think that happened for my kids.
So I think that this is a change that's happening across our country. The International Dyslexia Association is really pushing to try to make sure that we are catching kids with dyslexia as early as possible.
Dyslexia is not that uncommon, really, right? And so this screening is so huge so that we don't miss kids that would benefit from earlier interventions. So are there any populations that are more at risk of dyslexia?
Well, dyslexia does run in families. That said, it is pretty evenly distributed across different demographic groups. Historically, however, dyslexia has been more commonly diagnosed among boys than girls. And it's possible that there are some neurobiological differences in the brain structures and functions that can make males more vulnerable to developing dyslexia. But certainly one explanation is diagnostic bias. So what that means is that boys can tend to exhibit problem behaviors in response to their reading difficulties that get noticed by teachers, more so than girls. Girls kind of fly under the radar with their difficulties and may not be as readily identified. So again, the screening measures are a really positive move to helping to eliminate this possible source of diagnostic bias and identify all the kids who would benefit.
Yeah. So I think, a lot of people, including myself, have heard about dyslexia, but may not really know a lot about it. Like our caller, Anne, was concerned about, her child's ability to read.
But we've learned a lot about how to teach reading to children with dyslexia, and most kids with dyslexia will learn to read.
Great.
That said, there remain symptoms of dyslexia. This is not a disability that we are going to cure. This is a lifelong learning disability.
Yeah.
And so oftentimes kids with dyslexia, they may read more slowly or with more effort than a typically developing peer. And it may be more tiring to them to read lengthy passages. And so part of what we do as kids get older is help them learn workarounds, strategies for removing the barrier and making their reading more productive. So, for a kid who's going to go off to Harvard Medical School who's dyslexic, those tough medical words are going to be hard to read, and using a screen reader or an audio version while they follow along in the text is a great workaround strategy.
So really thinking about how you can find those tools to helping you have success can help.
And spelling is another one that remains really challenging for kids or individuals with dyslexia, even into adulthood. A lot of my dyslexic kids complain that they get to be 16, 17, 18 years old and they still don't know how to spell. And luckily, there are really great tools like a spell checker that can help them polish their writing and really be quite functional communicators through writing.
You're so right. And that helps everyone. And in fact, that's what I love about the concept of universal design when it comes to any disability, that a lot of times those accommodations, those tools that help an individual with a disability have success help us all be more successful. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Here's my second myth that I wanted to ask you that probably a lot of us have heard, that individuals with dyslexia have trouble writing and reading the letters, and they might read or write them backwards within a word, like mixing up the letters from the beginning and the end of a word. Is that true?
That's another one of those misconceptions, absolutely. So first of all, it is true that a lot of children do confuse reversible letters. Is it a lowercase b? Is it a lowercase d? It's really difficult to tell. Am I looking at the word did or is it the word bib, right? Like that's a tricky one. And I will say that you will see, if you're a kindergarten teacher, probably a good fraction of your class is reversing lowercase b and d. If you're a first grade teacher, it's a somewhat smaller percentage. If children get to second grade and they're still reversing letters, it's time for someone to give some careful instruction into those letters. But it's, may not be a sign of a reading disability like dyslexia. So the other thing that you mentioned was actually seeing words backwards. So a common one is to look at the word was and read it as saw, right, to see the letters sort of backwards. And I think that it's really beguiling to think that there's a mirror image being laid down in the kid's head, but that's really not what's happening. This is more of a sign that the kid is taking that strategy I was talking about earlier and trying to snap a picture of the word. Right? And was and saw have the same three letters. They're just in a different order. But if you're not using the sound structure of the word to help you organize the word, then there's no reason for you to necessarily remember that was starts with a W and saw starts with an S. So it's only when you can really think about the sounds in the words that anchors that was starts with W and saw starts with S. And that's why those words are not the same, even though they have the same three letters.
That's really helpful, I think, to understand. They're not seeing a picture necessarily of it reversed, but, their recall is from whatever that, memory that they tried to create was. And so it may not match what's really on the paper. That's
right. Our memory is not precise,
no.
Right? And so they're just trying to reconstruct it. And was and saw do look an awful lot alike.
Yeah, I could totally see that. That makes sense. Well, thank you for clearing up those myths for us. I think that's really important for all of us to know. What happens once you have that diagnosis? How does a school or a parent handle a diagnosis if their child has dyslexia?
Great question. I think the most important consideration is that we are finding the right intervention program for a child, right? So often this will be the development of an individualized education program in collaboration with the child's school. As part of that, we know an awful lot about the kind of instruction that needs to happen to teach kids with dyslexia to read. We have a scientific body of evidence that suggests that systematic, explicit phonics instruction is essential for kids with dyslexia. And so that is certainly one component of reading intervention that would be necessary for a child with that diagnosis. That said, every kid with dyslexia is a little bit different. And so it's important that the team designing the intervention for the child firmly understands what are the child's strengths and what are his challenges. And that will allow them to develop a comprehensive program to support the child. And so there might be other components involved as well. Some kids need to work on reading fluency. Other kids might need to do some special work on reading comprehension or the development of vocabulary. Other kids may need some work with their academic self-esteem and how to manage their feelings with challenge, with academic challenge. So again, I would say the most important thing is that collaboration of the team to understand who the child is, what beyond dyslexia do they need to see in order to develop an appropriate individualized education plan.
So thinking about that for the general parent out there who's listening and, may have a child who's diagnosed with dyslexia, what kind of specialist should they be looking to work with to help create those plans?
Well, the first thing I want to say is that the public schools will provide a comprehensive evaluation of any child that potentially has a learning disability. So
Great.
working with the public school is a great first strategy to try to get some diagnostic information about the child, and to start to develop an individualized education plan that can, help the child make more effective progress. That said, there are clinical settings where parents and schools can sometimes get some assistance. So
Okay.
my program at Boston Children's
Yes.
Hospital is the Learning Disabilities Program, and we're a multidisciplinary team that does evaluations of kids who are struggling in school.
It's so great that we have a learning disabilities program here that parents can reach out to for that additional support and evaluation.
Yeah.
Tell me more about it.
Yeah, so we have a team of 5 clinicians that work with the child. So the child will come to the clinic and spend morning and the early part of an afternoon with us, and they'll spend some time with each one of our clinicians. So we have an oral and written language specialist, that's like me. They see a math specialist.
Wow.
Not all kids with dyslexia have difficulties in math, but sometimes the strengths that a child might show in math help us to understand their learning profile. So we assess every kid in oral and written language and mathematics.
Wow.
And then they also see a psychologist, a neurologist, and a neuropsychologist.
Oh my goodness, that's amazing.
It's a full day, but they're very different sessions, and kids tend to have a good time with us.
Oh, that's great.
The academic evaluators, we all former teachers, so we know how to work with kids. But what's really nice about that is we get 5 different views of a child, of what they can do, what their strengths are, how they go about academic tasks. And we get really interesting information about how different parts of the brain are working together.
Yeah.
And that helps us to make really good recommendations about how things might be done a little bit differently in school to help the child make effective progress.
I think that's so valuable for parents to look out for those additional resources if they need it, or if they feel like they're struggling. And I think even for my kids, I know that we weren't in public school in the beginning, so we didn't have that comprehensive evaluation that I think we wish we had. And now that we're in public school, I mean, we're learning so much, and it sounds like your team is such a great resource for kids who may not be in public school, or for kids who just may have complex learning profiles and really benefit from that multidisciplinary approach. You mentioned that there was a psychologist in there. Why is that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, our psychologists are amazingly valuable members of our team. A lot of times kids with dyslexia may have social strengths, right? Like that might be an area where we can actually capitalize on their strengths that the psychologist has identified for us. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that peer-assisted learning can be an effective medium for teaching kids with dyslexia to read. However, some kids with dyslexia have, social difficulties, and that may not be the best way to teach them. Another common difficulty that is identified by our psychologists are kids who have anxious tendencies, or maybe even a full-fledged anxiety disorder.
Yeah.
And that can interact with dyslexia, where the kids, when they're reading, can start to feel really anxious. And that causes them to lean away from challenge rather than leaning toward challenge. And we all know that, learning, you have to lean toward challenge in order to make progress. So understanding how a child is understanding their own learning and their own kind of sense of self can really help us to make positive recommendations for all aspects of a child's development.
It's great because we want to treat the whole child, right?
Yes.
Every child is unique and complex in an amazing way. And
Right.
so to be able to have all those experts looking at each individual child is really great.
Yeah.
What is the long-term prognosis, so to speak? Like what should parents know about long-term challenges or potential for their kid?
There's absolutely no limit to the potential of a child with dyslexia. The diagnostic process often seems to focus overly on what the child can't do, right? That's part of what we have to go through in order to identify a child as having dyslexia. But it's really important to keep a focus also on all the things that the child can do. And if you take a look, out in the real world, there are many, many highly successful individuals with dyslexia. I think that an important consideration is developing an intervention plan to help the child develop functional literacy skills. That is certainly an important piece of what needs to be done. But I think just as important as that is understanding who this child is and what their aspirations are, and then helping them to identify the pathway toward achieving those aspirations. And for some kids with dyslexia, that may mean understanding how dyslexia is going to make that more challenging and then finding workarounds. It's really important for parents to keep in mind that there's not a race to developing literacy, and that supporting their child's social emotional health is just as important as building those reading skills.
It's such good advice, I think, and hopefully puts a lot of parents at ease that may be listening and thinking, what is my child capable of? What does their future look like? And, also that timeline, right? There's a lot of pressure to compare your child to other peers or other kids in their class, and, sort of realizing that each child's on their own trajectory and their own journey, and giving them the tools to be as successful as possible is all that matters.
Absolutely. And I think that, a child who is feeling successful will keep leaning into the challenges inherent in learning. And I think that's where we want to keep them. That's where we want to help them to reach, and we want to keep them kind of in that productive learning space.
That makes all the sense in the world, yeah. They need that confidence to be able to continue to move forward. I've learned a lot about dyslexia. I'm curious, in the field of, understanding dyslexia and treating dyslexia, I always ask each of our guest experts what research is going on that maybe your team is involved in, or that is the sort of the future for looking at dyslexia.
Well, so there's a lot of really exciting research on dyslexia happening at Boston Children's right now in different programs. There are some scholars who are looking at earlier identification and prediction of which kids are going to have dyslexia. I have a colleague who's also looking at visual processing in kids with dyslexia. I mean, I've talked to you about how dyslexia is really involved with the sounds in our language and rapidly retrieving verbal information. But there's some really exciting research looking at potential visual subtypes of dyslexia. At Boston Children's, we're actually comparing kids with dyslexia with other types of learning disabilities that can affect reading. So one interesting subgroup we've been comparing with dyslexic children are kids with dyspraxia, which is a motor disability, but turns out to have some really interesting cognitive symptoms that can affect reading. So it really helps us to understand the differences in kids who have reading difficulties.
Wow, that's really fascinating. I feel like there's so much more that we have to learn in this area, and so kudos to you and your team for helping us to learn better so that we can help our kids learn better. That's great.
Yeah.
Well, as we wrap up near the end, I always love to ask our experts, is there anything we haven't talked about that you would love to share or like to share with our audience today?
Yeah, I would say that I think that there's a firm appreciation for the importance of teaching kids to read. But I would caution parents and teachers not to get overly focused on our academic goals with kids, that we need to be paying as much attention to their social emotional health and how they're feeling about themselves as learners, that we need to balance our intervention approaches to make sure that kids are feeling successful and productive as learners. So it can be really tempting to push your child to do a little extra tutoring, after school. Yes. I once had a kid who was doing an hour of specialized tutoring every afternoon, and they never got to play, right? And a lot of childhood is play, right? So I think we need to balance. This is not a race to literacy. This is about developing a child who is happy and successful and learning. And so keeping that balance in mind, I think, is important.
Good advice for all of us parents, including myself, to hear. Well, thank you so much. Now it's time for the best part, which is doctor's orders. This is the part of the show where we ask you as our guest expert to prescribe something that parents can do to help their kids have a healthy, happy life. Yeah. Dr. Pierce, what are your doctor's orders?
My doctor's orders here would be to help your child identify what makes them passionate about learning, even if it's not reading, and support them in developing those interests where they feel successful. There's a lot about school that doesn't feel successful to a child with dyslexia. So help them find their successes and celebrate those, and make those real celebrations. I think that is one of the most important considerations.
It's really great advice, and great advice for all parents out there to hear when it comes to our kids and their academic journey. Thank you.
Thank you.
Many thanks to our guest parent, Anne, and our guest expert, Dr. Margaret Pierce. As always, thanks for listening in to Boston Children's Answers Parentcast. See you all next month.